I always try and pick the biggest salal berries because they're the only ones that taste good, in my opinion. And also I find it's a way of sharing with wildlife, because these berries are going to taste delicious to me, and the smaller berries have a more concentration of seeds. And when we actually did a chemistry project with 4th and 5th graders, and we looked at the nutritional value of salal, and we found that a lot of the protein, for example, not surprisingly, is in the seeds. And so it seems like leaving some of the smaller berries for wildlife is a nice way of giving them the higher protein berries and also eating ones that taste delicious to people. But I like to pick the whole raceme, which is also fine because these are flowering stalks. They're not going to form new leaves. And so I'm not taking something away from the plant that it needs to grow next year. They also mature over a period of time. So often you'll get a raceme and it'll have ripe berries at one end and unripe berries at the other. So I try and aim for one where most of the berries are ripe. It's the one thing I harvest where people most often tell me they had no idea they could eat it. And I find that fascinating because it doesn't require special preparation. It looks a lot like blueberries, but it doesn't seem to be on most people's radar as an edible plant. They dry well. They dry whole, but because they have such a thick skin and it's kind of a little waxy, a little sticky, they take a couple days in the dehydrator to dry. So another way of drying them, which actually makes it easier to rehydrate them, is to mash them first, which is more traditional. Salal were often stored as salal cakes. So if you mash them up, you get this beautiful, deep purple, sort of sticky pile with lots of seeds in it, and sort of make them into little mounds in a dehydrator. And you get very dense berry that you can then stick in a bag, and it's stable until you want to use it, and then you just have to soak it in water, and you've got berry mash again. They're also quite nice, just fresh. I've used them to make salsa, for example. I've made ketchup with them, where you add lots of vinegar and spices, and then that tends to keep them fruitier and less funky. But most of the time, I either dry them or freeze them, or eat them just fresh, just like this. Sometimes, when they're dried, you can powder them and use that powder to flavor pastry in particular. It gives it a deep purple color and a flavor kind of like rich blueberry. And I think they're delicious, and obviously they grow better here than blueberries do. They grow wild here. They keep pretty well in the fridge, so you can just stem them right away, or you can just seal the bag up and keep them in the fridge probably about a week before you finish processing them. For harvesting any kind of wild berry, you want to first make sure you know what you're harvesting. The nice thing about salal is that it's quite distinctive. There's not much that looks like it that isn't salal. Then you want to make sure you're harvesting someplace that's safe to harvest. And then making sure that it's someplace where it's okay to harvest. So on some public lands, you can harvest berries that you're going to consume that day. On some public lands, you're not allowed to harvest berries at all. And on state parks, for example, if you're in a recreational area, generally you can harvest 2 gallons per person per day for personal use. So that's a very generous limit. And the only caveat is you're not supposed to harvest in a way that's destructive to the plant. So if you're harvesting mushrooms, for example, you don't want to be raking the ground. You want to be just targeting the ones you're after. And if you're harvesting salal, you don't want to be blazing a trail into the salal. You want to stay on the trails, which is for salal works great. Sometimes I think with the local parks, we tend to assume that they're for visitors. And I would encourage people on the islands to recognize that these are our parks as well, and that we should be able to enjoy them both recreationally, but also for sustenance, to be able to harvest food in our public land. It's important to know what you're harvesting, to know where you can harvest it, and to harvest it responsibly. So I'm always encouraging people to go after the foods that are abundant. It's more efficient for you, but also means that you're not going to be depleting a scarce resource. And salal certainly fits in that category.